This time we're going to take a look at aligning shapes, orienting shapes to one another, and ways of making them visible and invisible so that it's easier to work with our complex shapes. I'll start by moving out a cylinder and a box. All right, now if I look at these shapes from the top and switch to orthographic view so I can see more clearly what's going on, if I want to precisely abut these shapes, it's fairly easy if I have the grid set to a whole number and the size of the shapes. This is 20 long and the diameter of the cylinder is also 20. But if this shape were, say, 19.4 and this one were 15.45, then it's a little harder because with the grid on, obviously it's going to want to jump around. But even if I turn the grid off, I can kind of see what's going on. But if I zoom in, well, okay, so this cylinder is not smooth, so I'm going to go ahead and smooth it out. But looks like it's touching, but the more I zoom in, there's a micro gap there. So how do you get these two shapes to precisely abut one another? Well, if I select both, there's an align tool, which you would think would help. But if I choose, let me see, I'm just going to make this one shorter so it'll be clearer. So if I select everything and choose align, if I click the middle button, it centers both of them in relation to one another, right? So actually I'm going to make this bigger so we can see what's going on. So if I center it, the shapes are centered. I can center them from front to back as well, or I can align them to the right, or to the left, or to the top, or the bottom. But that's not accomplishing what I want. What I want is to have this abutting precisely with the square. Okay, so one way we can do that is by dragging out a ruler. Now, I have the cylinder shape selected, and you can see the dimensions, 20 by 19.4. But you can also see these numbers here. And so those numbers are showing you the distance from the origin point, this origin point. So if I change that to 0, it drops it down in relation to the origin. And if I change that to 0, so that shape is precisely over there. And I know that this is 19.4 wide. So if I click on the square and I change this to 19.4, and then I could drop it down. So those are precisely abutting now at this point. So I could select both of these now and choose align and bring that one up. So it's centered from front to back, but it's precisely abutting the square from side to side. To get rid of the ruler, you just click the X to dismiss ruler. But while I'm in here, I'll point out one other thing. You also have the option to use the ruler as a midpoint. So if I click that and then I click on the cylinder, for instance, you'll see that the midpoint is selected. So if I change the distance from the origin to 0, 0, you can see it puts the cylinder precisely at that point. Then I could switch back and make that 0. And so now that corner of the lower left-hand corner meets precisely at the center of that cylinder. So again, I can click the X to dismiss the ruler. Now I could combine my shapes, and I've been able to precisely align those shapes the way that I want. Switch back to perspective view, move that out of the way. Now, we know that we can lift a shape and move it around. So I'm going to drag another cylinder out, make it small, make it smooth. So what I'd like to do, theoretically, is I'd like to place the cylinder on this face of this complex shape. So how would I do that? Well, I can drag it up and I can move it over and kind of try to manipulate my way around here to see what's going on. I can zoom in. Let's see, rotate it, I guess. Well, it's not quite. So very difficult, right? You could do it. It would take you hours to get it right. So I'm going to move this back over. Actually, I'm going to just delete it. because what I'm going to do is I'm going to click and drag a work plane out, and I'm going to plop it right on top of that facet where I would like this cylinder to sit. Okay, now that I'm looking straight on, now I'm going to click and drag out a cylinder, shift to resize it proportionally to the size that I want, F to zoom in, shift to make it smaller, use the sides slider to make it have smooth sides. Okay, I've got that the way that I want it. Now, how do you get rid of that new work plane that you've added? All you need to do is position your screen so that you can see the outline of the original work area, and then click and drag the work plane and drop it back onto that original work plane, and that now takes over. So if I zoom in here, now I would like to make that cylinder shorter. So this is the height measurement, right? So if I click and drag that down, theoretically that should make the cylinder shorter, right? But what's going on here? So because I now have the old work plane orientation set, this adjuster is resizing that shape in relation to that work plane. So I'm creating this odd shape. Maybe that's what you desire, and that's fine, but that's not what I was shooting for. So I'm going to Control Z to get back to the original here. So what I can do, again, is drag a work plane out, make sure it's on that same facet that I was on before. Okay. Now notice that the orientation tools on the cylinder have changed. They're now oriented in relation to the new work plane, this yellow-orange work plane. So if I click and drag the height of the cylinder, it behaves in the way that I expect and hope it will. And again, to get rid of the temporary work plane, I can click and drag a new one out to the original work plane area, and there it is. So now I can combine these shapes, and I have my new complex shape. So I'll drag that out. Now I'm going to drag out yet another cylinder, smooth it down again. And so what I'd like to do is to create a hollow in the bottom of this. I'll start by using a hemisphere, shift to make it proportional, click on hole to make it a negative, move this over, select both, align front to back and side to side, group. Okay, so indeed there's a hemispheric hole in the bottom of this cylinder. One very handy trick is, especially when you have more shapes combined together, you can click on color and choose transparent. So now I can see the hole without having to look at the bottom. I mean, this can be very handy, for instance, if the hole is in the center, there's no way you could see it without making the shape transparent. There's a keyboard shortcut too for transparency. So with that shape selected, click on it, and then if I tap the T key on the keyboard, it toggles between transparent, non-transparent, transparent, non-transparent. So now what I'd like to do, instead of having a hemispheric indentation at the bottom, I would like a conical indentation. So I'm going to drag out a cone, 10, tab, 10, okay, make it a little shorter, move it inside there, select, center it, okay. Now, I can't see it, but I can click on the cylinder and tap transparent to see it. And that's okay. But I forgot to make that cone into a negative shape. So how am I going to do that? It's inside. I could move the shapes around again. In this case, would be a fairly straightforward process, but it may be that you have shapes precisely aligned and you don't want to have to go through the pain of realigning them again. Fortunately, there's a handy trick you can use here. Cylinder selected. I'm going to click the light bulb icon and hide that shape. So it's still there, it's just hidden. So now I can click on the cone, turn it into a negative, and up at the top there's a light bulb icon, and if I click that it will show me all of my shapes. Okay, apparently I hid another shape earlier. Alright, so now if I select those two and merge or group, I now have a cone-shaped hole or indentation in that cylinder. Those are some of the ways that you can orient and move and align your shapes when creating a model in Tinkercad.